The Arrowverse has 20 seasons, and each one of these seasons has a main villain. These villains are almost all adaptations of characters from DC Comics, some of them looser than others, which is what we're going to be looking at in this video, ranking all the main villains in the Arrowverse based off how comic book accurate they are to their comic book counterpart. This video will not include characters like Rhea or Mullis, the main villains of Legends of Supergirl Season 2 and Legends of Tomorrow Season 3 respectively, because they are original characters. It will also not include the Legion of Doom, main villains of Legends of Tomorrow Season 2, although the actual characters, Malcolm Merlyn, Eobarthon, Damian Darhk, they will be included as they were main villains of their own seasons. The actual team and their comic book counterpart, the Legion of Doom, will not be included because there are too many variations and adaptations of the team to really have a clear comic book counterpart in terms of their goals, motivations, and their membership. Also, the original Legion of Doom is not from the comics, and on top of that, do I also include the Injustice League in that comparison? So I couldn't really include the Legion of Doom on this list, but the actual members of the team, the main three at least, Malcolm Merlyn, Eobarthon, and Damian Darhk, they will be included. With all of that out of the way, let's actually get into the list, starting with number 17.
That's good. That just leaves one more monster for me to kill.
Now, Grace Gibbons, aka the Cicada version 2, is a little complicated here because she doesn't technically have a comic book counterpart. There is, in the comics, a character named David Hirsch, aka Cicada, who on the show was kind of separated into three different characters. There is David Hirsch himself, who was like the thought to be Cicada, the Cicada on different universes. Then there's Orlin Dwyer, the original Cicada, and then his niece/daughter, Grace Gibbons, aka the second Cicada. Since she is the main villain, I'm still going to use her as the comparison to the Cicada in the comics, and this is basically as comic book inaccurate as you can get. They gender swapped Cicada, making him a female, and also giving him the name Grace Gibbons instead of David Hirsch. They drastically changed the powers from the lightning dagger being able to absorb life force out of people, and also he was immortal, to the lightning dagger acting similar to Mjolnir and is also capable of draining metahuman abilities out of people. And Cicada in this universe, Cicada version 2, also has additional powers outside of that. They drastically changed the backstory, and they drastically changed the motivation, the design. She's not the first Cicada. Everything about this character, even the fact that she is a villain for Barry Allen and not Wally West like the comic book version of Cicada, makes Cicada version 2 probably the least comic book accurate main villain in the entirety of the Arrowverse.
The Green Arrow is mine. You kill him, you die. Who are you? Prometheus.
Prometheus is barely an adaptation of the comic book character at all. His costume is changed so drastically that he is barely recognizable. In fact, he's not recognizable at all as the comic book character. He's given a name, while the comic book version of Prometheus doesn't have one. He has two: Simon Morrison, his real name, as well as his fake name, Adrian Chase. His backstory and motivation are also changed incredibly drastically, from his criminal parents were killed by cops and he swears vengeance against all justice, to his father was killed by the Hood, who would later become the Green Arrow, and now he swears revenge against that vigilante. He was also drastically powered down from a character who could defeat the entirety of the Justice League to a character who, although not as good as a fighter as Green Arrow, he definitely can outsmart him. And he was also changed from a villain who is more of a villain for Batman, Green Arrow, and Justice League to really being strictly for the Green Arrow, so he's definitely very comic book inaccurate.
Never forget, I am the fastest man alive.
Zoom is pretty damn inaccurate as a villain or as a character. He was changed from a villain of Wally West to a villain of Barry Allen instead. His costume was drastically changed from yellow, very similar to the Reverse Flash, to just entirely black, and the actual design of his mask was changed drastically as well. His powers were changed from being able to slow down time to regular speedster powers. He was changed to being from an alternate universe, and he takes V9, which the comic book version does not. His motivation and backstory were changed drastically, from his motivation in the comics being he wants to make Wally West a better hero, and in the show he just wants to be the fastest speedster in the entirety of the multiverse. His backstory changed from in the comics being a friend of Wally's who gained powers through an accident with the cosmic treadmill, and in the show a serial killer who gained super speed from the particle accelerator explosion on Earth 2. Definitely incredibly inaccurate, but I think just like Prometheus, he was changed for the better.
Please tell me you're seeing him.
Oh, I see him.
We have to take him together.
No, I'll cover Sabotage. You just get that stone.
Sabotage was changed from a Wally West villain to a Barry Allen villain, and his costume was changed so drastically that, again, he's not recognizable as the comic book counterpart at all, although I do think his costume was so much better on the show. His backstory was also changed completely. His character in general was changed completely. They kind of used a different character as more inspiration for this version of Sabotage than Sabotage himself. The Future Flash was a very similar, or at least a more similar design and concept, a very similar concept, more similar design to this version of Sabotage than Sabotage from the comics. Still, though, we're not comparing him to that Future Flash, we're comparing it to Sabotage himself, and as such, he is incredibly comic book inaccurate.
I want to know everything about this Green Arrow, where he lives and who he loves, and I want him off the boards by the time my associates arrive. And if I don't help you, well, then I would be surprised, because I think I made it abundantly clear you don't have a choice.
Damian Darhk was changed from being a villain of the Titans to being a villain of the Green Arrow, as well as the Legends. He has no magical powers in the comics, where he does here. He has this kind of backstory with the League of Assassins and Ra's al Ghul, which he does not have in the comics either. His motivation was drastically changed from just working for Hive to wanting to destroy the entirety of the world and create a new one. He also is second command in the Titans for Hive, while here he is the head of it, which is kind of minor. And also another minor thing is that his hair was changed from brown to blonde. I still think that Damian Darhk is definitely a very comic book inaccurate costume, as he's barely recognizable in terms of his abilities and in terms of how significant he is as a villain.
Topknot is weak.
Rayn's overall design is changed drastically from looking like more of an alien character to just a human being, or at least in terms of how they look. Also, the costume was changed as well. She was given a dual identity and a human name in Samantha Arias, as well as just an Earthling counterpart dual identity, which the comic book version does not have at all. She's also given the added powers of the other world killers, which she doesn't have in the comics, and instead of being created by Kara's father in the comics, here she's created by these dark Kryptonians. Rayn is definitely not very accurate to the comics, but at least she's more accurate than all the villains we've gone over so far. The Thinker, aka Clifford DeVoe, was changed from a Jay Garrick villain to a Barry Allen villain in the Arrowverse. His costume was also changed, although for the most part, both of the versions of the Thinker in the comics, as well as in the Arrowverse, don't really wear their costume for the most part. He, in the Arrowverse, is married to a gender-swap mechanic, instead of there being no relation between the two in the comics. Here, his motivation has changed. He's a technophobe who wants to rid the world of devices and teach them a new way of living, instead of, in the comics, he's really just a very smart mob boss. Also, he's way more powerful here in the Arrowverse than he is in the comics, with the powers of these 12 bus metas that he created, and also his incredible intelligence that he does have in the comics.
And I knew about it. I let our father die because he didn't deserve to live. And neither do you. My brother.
Emiko Queen has one huge major difference from the comics and like a couple more minor ones. The minor ones are she's changed from the daughter of Robert Queen and Shadow to being the daughter of Robert Queen, as well as this other woman, something Adachi, I don't remember. Anyway, she's also here the leader of the Ninth Circle, instead of just being associated with the Ninth Circle when she was a villain for a little bit, and she's never called the Red Arrow, which is her comic book superhero name in the comics. I don't know why I said comics twice. Anyway, the big change is that she's changed from a hero, although she was an antagonist briefly, she is mainly a hero in the comics, to being just a fully fledged 100% villain. Not only that, but a main villain in the Arrowverse, which is why Emiko Queen is definitely not very comic book accurate. Even though we are getting to the top 10, or we just started the top 10, still the main villains are not very accurate at all. It's really just 6-1, or maybe even just 5-1 that I think are very accurate to the comics.
I'm not a murderer. I'm a force of nature. A servant of fate. I enable destiny. I love you, J. Arrow. I always will.
Most of the changes to Vandal Savage come from his backstory, which is probably the most significant part about him. Instead of being 50,000 years old, a caveman with no connection to Hawkman or Hawkgirl named Vander Edge, he is from a couple thousand years ago, not 50,000 like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago from Egyptian times. He has a shared origin with Hawkman and Hawkgirl as well as a shared fate. He has to kill them over and over and over again in every single one of their lives so he can continue his immortality, which is not true in the comics at all. He just has a full immortality and no connection to Hawkman and Hawkgirl. His original name is changed from Vander Edge, I don't know how to pronounce that, to Hath-Seth, which Hath-Seth is a completely different character altogether who has a connection to Hawkman and Hawkgirl in their shared origin story. And on top of all that, he has an accent, which is not true in any other interpretation of the character, and I doubt that is true in the comics either.
Oh, come on now, don't be shy.
You're a little late, Johnny. I've sort of taken over jolly old Ray.
Neuron is mostly changed in his design, or at least that's the main change, which is quite possibly the most drastic design change in the entirety of the Arrowverse. He goes from wearing this huge green armor to just being a smoke monster or a man with holes for a head. Anyway, he changed his motivation from just wanting to collect souls to be the ruler of hell to wanting to unleash hell on Earth, to turn Earth into hell again. He's powered way down. In the comics, he's a Justice League level threat, while here, he's very easily defeated by one spell from John Constantine. Also, like I said, he is a villain of Constantine and the Legends instead of a villain of the Justice League. Still, though, I think that the fact that he's a demon, his hell connection, and some of his powers are definitely at least a little bit accurate.
Tell your parents I said hello.
Tell them yourself!
Nonna is pretty different in some regards, but at least he's very similar in his general personality and his backstory, at least a little bit. In the comics, he is just basically muscle for General Zod. He's a part of General Zod's army. He's basically his second or third in command or something. While here, he has his own army, or he's kind of second in command to Aster before taking over as commander and general of that army. His backstory has definitely changed quite a lot, but I feel like he's a very similar character. I'm not going to say he's accurate at all, as he has no connection to General Zod at all here in this version of the show, and also he's a Supergirl villain instead of Superman villain, but there isn't really any 100% huge significant changes to the character that would make him lower on the list.
It's like I said. Life ain't fair.
Ricardo Diaz, although very high on the list, is still not 100% very comic book accurate. The biggest change to the character from the comics is that in the comics he's said to be one of the best fighters on the planet, and the Green Arrow doesn't stand a chance at all to a relatively good fighter who the Green Arrow is definitely a better fighter than. His motivation is changed from his father was exposed and I'm pretty sure incarcerated because of the Green Arrow, and now he seeks revenge, to in the Arrowverse he grew up in an orphanage and a kid called him a loser, so he wants to prove him wrong by taking over Star City. He's also in the comics the leader of the Longbow Hunters instead of just hiring them here, and also he was never called Richard Dragon in the Arrowverse, and I don't think he's Ricardo Diaz Jr., he's just Ricardo Diaz. The last two things aren't very significant, but the fact that he's nowhere near as good a fighter and his backstory and motivation are definitely enough to keep him from the top 5, and again, now we get to the actual pretty comic book accurate main villain in the Arrowverse with the top 5. Slade is kind of weird for this list because while he has a lot of technical changes from the comics which do kind of make him very, very different, he feels 100% comic book accurate, although there are definitely a lot of changes, like he is made into a strictly Green Arrow villain, or really the Arrow villain, instead of being a villain of the Teen Titans, the Titans, Batman, and way less significantly the Green Arrow himself. He's changed from an American mercenary to an Australian member of Australian intelligence who later becomes a mercenary. He's given a connected backstory backstory with Oliver, including Oliver being responsible for his eye instead of Slade's wife being responsible. He's given a Japanese super soldier serum called Mirakuru, which replaces a government experiment giving Slade his powers, and that serum that he was given in the Arrowverse made him go mad, while in the comics he never did. These changes are they're very abundant, but they don't really feel like differences for the character from the comics, which is why he makes it to the top 5 despite all these changes. Ra's al Ghul is kind of the opposite of Slade on this list because while he doesn't really feel as cool or badass or that similar to the comic book counterpart, there are not a lot of changes from the comics for this character. The main change is that instead of being a Batman villain, he is a Green Arrow villain, or at least, I guess, an Arrow villain. Although that isn't confirmed, he probably did go up against the Batman in the past, as Talia al Ghul has some sort of past with somebody from Gotham City, so he probably did, we don't know. So he's not strictly a Green Arrow villain, but that definitely is pretty significant, as the Green Arrow or Oliver Queen did kill Ra's al Ghul, so it's definitely something there. Instead of being 600 years old, he's only 160, and he's not the first Ra's al Ghul, but those changes are not very significant, and other than him being a Green Arrow villain instead of Batman villain, he's very, very comic book accurate in terms of how he is, in terms of his abilities, in terms of his backstory for the most part, in terms of his role in the League of Assassins.
You're gonna be disappointed, pal. Thanks to you on
Starting off the top 3, we have Malcolm Merlyn, aka the Dark Archer, who is an adaptation of Arthur King, aka Merlyn, also the Dark Archer. Now, you might think that the name Malcolm Merlyn as opposed to Arthur King would be a pretty significant change that might bump him down lower on the list, but the reason it doesn't is because there was no change at all. In a Arrow tie-in comic written by John Barrowman, it was revealed and retconned in that Malcolm Merlyn's original name was Arthur King and that he legally changed it to Malcolm Merlyn for a reason I honestly cannot remember, but I would recommend it. I remember really liking the comic when I read it, but this means that he is a direct adaptation of the comic book character Arthur King, and there was no name change. That being said, there are some other changes, like the fact that he went from just being an assassin and also member of the League of Assassins to being a billionaire who, although is a member of the League of Assassins, the fact that he's a billionaire is a pretty significant change, and also he has a past with Oliver as both Oliver's best friend's father and a work associate with Oliver's father himself. Also, Merlyn is directly responsible for the quote-unquote accident that stranded Oliver on the island, as opposed to becoming enemies with Oliver later in his career. That being said, these changes I don't think are significant enough to knock him down past or below the top 3.
At least he's a good man.
He is not a man! I was the man of tomorrow, not him! Not him!
Lex Luthor is one of the most comic book accurate characters in the entirety of the Arrowverse, and in terms of the main villains, he is number 2. The differences from the comics are barely there. Really, the only difference is that here he has a beard, while he has never had that in the comics at all, which is pretty insignificant, but honestly, that's the only reason that he is lower than number 1, because other than that, there's no changes. His design in terms of how he looks other than the beard, and is also his Alexo suit, which in the comics is called a power suit or a war suit. It's so similar, and also his motivation of hating Kryptonians, wanting to be a hero in the eyes of everyone, and the fact that he hates Superman so much, his rivalry with Superman, everything about him, his backstory, everything is 100% except for his beard, making it 99% comic book accurate, putting him at number 2 on this list. So, looking at the character of the Reverse Flash, there's barely any changes, and the ones that are there are incredibly insignificant. There are two insignificant changes, like he's never called Professor Zoom, which he is sometimes in the comics. That was his main superhero villain name for a while, but the reason that's insignificant is because he's no longer really Professor Zoom. He is the Reverse Flash. That is his main name. Zoom is Hunter Zolomon, Reverse Flash is Hugh Barthel, and Professor Zoom is really nobody. The other change is that his costume, they added a lot of black to it, especially in the pants area. But that is so insignificant because the costume, except for that part of it, is so comic book accurate, and I think Reverse Flash has absolutely no changes from the comics. Now, yes, the comic book version of Reverse Flash has never become Harrison Wells, never disguised himself as Harrison Wells for a while, and was a member of Team Flash either, but this is not like changes to the comics. This is not thing that they changed about the character. This is really just a new story that they gave him with the exact same backstory, motivation, and everything about the character from the comics. I mean, they've explained everything. The negative Speed Force connection, his backstory, why he hates the Flash, the fact that he killed Nora Allen in the past / the future. Everything is so comic book accurate down to the most minute detail, other than his costume design isn't 100%, and he's never been called Professor Zoom. Those things are so insignificant that I would say the Reverse Flash is 100% comic book accurate, and probably the most comic book accurate character in the entirety of the Arrowverse, but definitely the most comic book accurate main villain. So anyway, that is my list for the most comic book accurate characters in the entirety of the Arrowverse. Let me know your thoughts in the comments about this list, and maybe some other ideas for other rankings / lists, and maybe even tier lists in the comments down below. And let me know your own list for this whole thing. Let me know in the comments all those things. And if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching.